and welcome to Eidsvoll 1814, the Constitutional Museum of Norway. My name is Bård Frydenlund and I am the CEO of this wonderful museum. On this tour, which is recorded due to the COVID-19 situation, we will take you through this building, the history and the context of the creation of the Norwegian Constitution. So please join me inside this wonderful building. We are now inside the building of Karsten Anker, who was the host of the Constitutional Assembly here at Eidsvoll in 1814. This is the very building where the Norwegian Constitution was debated, written and also voted for during the 6 weeks of April and May in 1814. We are now in the hallway. This is a hallway of a very classic continental building. We were part of the Denmark-Norway, an autocracy ruled from Copenhagen at the time, and the influence for Karsten Anker came mainly from the continent. This, of course, started before 1814. The building was here, and it was part of an ironwork installation. This was established already in the 1620s during the 30 Years' War. This was part of the war economy of Denmark-Norway. It was of importance to have an ironwork to produce iron for, of course, the weapon industry. But it changes hand from state-owned business to private ownership during the 18th century. The Schlanbusch family was a very significant family owning this estate until, well, it shifted many hands, but in 1793, Karsten Anker purchased it. He was then a very significant civil servant in Copenhagen, one of the most significant Norwegian-born ones. Anker was part of a merchant and civil servant family in Norway, one of the most significant timber exporting families in Norway. You might say, according to the gentleman ideal of Norwegian elite at the time, it was one of the main assets for an elite person in Norway at that time was to have its own estate in the country. And this was what also drove Karsten Anker to buy Eidsvoll Verk, as we call it. Okay, let's start going into the green room. This is also not only a significant room in 1814, but also a significant room now to look upon the restoration project, which was the most significant project leading up to the bicentennial anniversary in 2014. A lot of kroner was put into the project, mainly re-establishing all the structure of the building, but also the interiors. You can see here, this was formerly, before 2007, known as the Poolroom, where there were a pool table, but they found out during the sources that the pool table was not part of the interior in 1814. So, using the ideal of equipping the building as it looked like for the founding fathers of Norway, when they arrived here in April 1814, it was the ideal to make the interiors as close to that position in April 1814 as possible. So that's why there's no pool table here, although the lighting was established. So you have the lighting arrangements actually put up. Well, here in the green room, we use this room for learning purposes. So here we also set the context of the situation before, when all the founding fathers met here in April and May 1814. And this period, early 19th century, was very much a part of the Norwegian Enlightenment. There's also a period of revolutions all around the world. You have, of course, the American revolutions with all the processes towards London. You had the French revolutions. You have many other revolutions as well. But it's also a period of constitutions. So the Constitution of 1814 in Norway was, you might say, the last of the liberal, radical constitutions in a period from the American in 1787 up to the end of Napoleon in 1815. And talking of Napoleon, this was also the time of the period of Napoleon. The Napoleonic Wars and the Norwegian history from this time is also linked up to that. So at least until 1807, Norway had been made, at least the bourgeoisie, the great merchants of Norway, had become rich because of all the international export of timber and iron. But until 1807, that was because of a neutrality position. But after 1807, the game was totally different. In 1807, the Brits bombarded Copenhagen, and that made not only Denmark but also Norway part of the Napoleonic Wars, taking the side of Napoleon. They used the church tower in the center of Copenhagen as they aimed their Congreve rockets from outside the city. And that, of course, made the then Crown Prince of Denmark, Frederick, his rationale was then to make an alliance with Napoleon. So that was, of course, a rational choice by the regent of Denmark, but it was not a very fortunate decision for Norway, because that made that Norway became in a war situation with England, its main importer of Norwegian timber. So from 1807 and all the way up to 1814, there was years of destabilization. There was some periods of war as well, and there was famine. Henrik Ibsen, one of the most famous authors in Norway, he wrote his Terje Vigen poem with the thematic issue from this war, the undernourishment of Norway, the need of getting grain from Denmark. And Terje Vigen was this kind of a seaman who brought grain from Denmark to Norway. So Napoleon is also very much part of this. Now, Napoleon, he had several of his marshals doing different works all around Europe, but one was more significant than the others, because he became his enemy, and that is Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, one of the field marshals of Napoleon, who in 1810 became the crown prince and leader of government of Sweden. And he was also designing, you might say, the main policy for Scandinavia from that time, from 1810. What is later known as the 1812 policy in Swedish historiography. Because as Karl Johan, as he was named as Swedish crown prince, he designed a new policy of allying with all the great powers of Europe against Napoleon, his former boss, so to say. And Napoleon was set, and he also got all the great powers on his side during 1812 and 1813. And what you might say, the solution for the period up to 1814 was that his gain was to get Norway as kind of a war bargain for doing his work against Napoleon. So this was a part of the picture, that Norway should become the prize to take part in the war against Napoleon. And this was the grand scheme up to when this was formally sanctioned in a treaty, the so-called Treaty of Kiel of 14th of January 1814. But in Norway, the year before, in 1813, a young prince of Denmark had arrived as the new stadtholder. His name was Christian Fredrik. He did not have the same curriculum vitae and all the experience that Karl Johan had, but he had a lot of charm, some kind of youth charisma that was applying positively to the Norwegian elites, and he got a lot of people who wanted to more or less revitalize the link between Norway and the Danish monarchy. And he was, of course, also a kind of crown prince to Denmark as well. So this was a man who also more or less worked against the big alliance and also the Treaty of Kiel, and was becoming the frontier man of the new, you might say, Norwegian revolt against this Treaty of Kiel. And we are going to look at follow that history in another room, the so-called garden room, where there was a very significant meeting in February 1814. But before that, we're going to take a short trip into the interiors of Lady Anker. As I said, Karsten Anker, he was a significant state official, you might say, civil servant. He had several positions of importance. For instance, he was the director, the head of the East Asia Company of Denmark. He was also the furniture company's director. He had significant positions in the Chamber of Commerce, the Chambers of Mining, and many other positions. You have his portrait here on this side, Karsten Anker. This room, which is the chamber of Lady Anker, Lady Hedvig Anker, who lived here for some years in this building. This room is very much equipped like an East Asian scenery, a tableau you might call it, because of the East Asian company's importance of importing, of course, tea and porcelain and different spices. So Karsten Anker was a significant man in Copenhagen, but when you are a significant man of Norwegian origin in Copenhagen, you might also get enemies, and he got enemies. Many of them German ministers around the King of Denmark who opposed many of his policies and also wanted to decrease his influence towards the king or the regent. So he more or less, he wasn't ostracized, he wasn't removed, but he was more or less told to leave, and he left Copenhagen and arrived here in Norway back in 1811 to be living here at full time at least from that point. And now we enter the private chamber of Hedvig Anker. As you see, and there was put a lot of effort and resources, and also highly qualified personnel into the interior. The wallpapers, as you can see, the wallpapers, which you can see also have a lot of influence from Greece and from Rome, the antique art influences. In this room you also see an iron stove, which was a significant feature here in these rooms. When you had an ironwork, you also, of course, equipped the heating system with iron stoves. We're now going to enter the second most important room of the building. I must just say that this is a one-take, no script recording, so you are freely to mock me afterwards for lacking a couple of words in English. I will have some involuntary breaks in between, but please forgive me for that. Okay? And now we enter the garden room. This is a very significant room because here was you might say, the initiation of the Norwegian revolt of 1814. In this room, 22 persons, in addition to the stadtholder, Prince Christian Fredrik, was gathered on the 16th of February to debate the Treaty of Kiel. The Treaty of Kiel said that during the negotiations and the wars against Napoleon, Sweden, or at least the King of Sweden, should get the Kingdom of Norway as his part from the King of Denmark. And of course that was very easy to go with for Swedes, but not as much for Norwegians. And under the leadership of Christian Fredrik, at least the former leadership, there was an uprising against it. A very, you might say, civilized kind of uprising, but still. So in this room, a large table with 22 delegates who were hand-chosen by the prince himself met to discuss this treaty. And by the end of the day, they decided that Christian Fredrik should call for elections all around Norway. A very new thing, of course, because this was part of the Danish autocracy, and elections and all other democratic features were not common, of course. And also that Christian Fredrik, he should rule as regent until this assembly should meet. It was also set that the date should be the 10th of April, and also that this assembly should design a constitution for Norway. So that's why we call it the Constitutional Assembly of Norway. And they are, of course, our founding fathers, as we see it in a political, historical view. But there was, you might say, an ideological differences between the delegates who met here in February of 1814, because some of them, and those who were the adjutants and the close connections to Christian Fredrik, wanted that Christian Fredrik should use his allodial right, his right as an inheritor of Norway. So he should just claim it as his part of his inheritance. Now, many of the other contributors and delegates, they said that this was not a very modern approach to state rule at the time, and that it had to put into consideration the way that this link between the king and the people was now broken, and when such a breach as has happened, the people itself should also be consulted on what they mean with making another link up to another royal person, in this case maybe Christian Fredrik. So under these circumstances, and under the arguments, especially from Professor Georg Sverdrup of the very newly born University of Oslo, or the Royal University of Frederick, it was called in its first years. He argumented that there is actually a more significant law than the royal law of the monarch, and that is the people's law. So by that they sanctioned some kind of a people's sovereignty for the rule of Norway to come. Okay, the decision was made on the 10th of April. The constitutional assemblies with delegates from at least all over southern Norway was to gather here at Eidsvoll again. But before that, what did a man like Karsten Anker know? What did he read? Well, some of that we can see in his library. Now, this is a dark library today, so we're going to let some more light in. This might be one of the most beautiful rooms in the building. This was the office, but also the library. And you might say it is very much the heart of the building. It's rather peculiarly designed, this room. You might say that it's more designed for a paranoid nobleman of France in the 1790s than it is for a civil servant, an elite person in the Norwegian countryside. So, because you can see here, there are at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different doors here. One who you can reach the first floor, down to the cellars, into the ladies' room there, and you can get out from this door, and also into the garden room over there. So there are plenty of exits here. So why did he have that? Well, it was more a kind of that is the fashion of the time more than the practical use of it, I guess. What about the books? The books here are mainly given as a gift from the National Library of Norway due to the centennial anniversary in 1914. And the other part is books that we have purchased back, looking into the protocols from the sale. After all, Karsten Anker went bankrupt in 1822, which of course is a disaster for the family, but a blessing for historians, you might say, because you see then where who the purchasers were, who were buying the books of Karsten Anker. And until 2 years ago, we have purchased back parts of this collection. So you might, this is a very beautiful room. It is not exactly the same books as Karsten Anker, but a very authentic collection at least. But now we're going to turn to other rooms that were very key to parts of the Constitutional Assembly. Well, politics is one thing, the practicalities and the logistics is another. In these rooms you see here, the main function was the meals actually. Because in these rooms there was at least 2 meals served every day. The logistics, well, the lodgings for all the representatives of the Constitutional Assembly, that was spread around the local farms in the vicinity around Eidsvoll Verk. So that was made a deal out of that. Only one person, Peder Anker, he was situated in one of the pavilions outside the building. Apart from that, all the others were at the local farms. So what about the food? Well, we know quite a lot from diaries, from memoirs and other things, and letter collections that have been sent to and from Eidsvoll. And there are at least 2 or 3 or 4 things that is mentioned several times. It's a rather disastrous cabbage soup that no one likes. There's also the amount of wine, and also the wine itself, because it was a bitter kind of wine. It was from Bordeaux in France, but it was not of high quality. The other thing was also wheel. Not that there was no problem with the wheel, but the problem was that it was served every day. Every dinner was wheel. So it was a very one-dimensional diet, you might say, for that purpose. The consumption of alcohol has been debated at Eidsvoll and for decades afterwards. They say, and this was made clear in an article written in 2014, about the household of this Constitutional Assembly in 1814. They say that it's 2,400 liters of red wine that was consumed, which is a little bit less than half a bottle of wine for each person each day, which is, well, it's not problematic, you might say. But then again, 2,600 liters of spirits, of liquor. Now, many might say that, which is then a little bit more than half a bottle of spirits for each person each day. Might indicate some kind of they might be a little more than tipsy, we might say, writing and debating the Constitution when consuming this themselves. But that doesn't say much of the consumer way of 1814. They had their servants, they had their transporters, they had adjutants. There were several people sharing that amount. So it's not that one delegate drank that much every day. Well, these rooms, as I said, where they ate. In this room, actually, this was called the Prince's Table, Prinsens Tafel. It was where Christian Fredrik himself, the stadtholder and also the regent for Norway, sat. And he of course had a staff of adjutants and everything, but at this table he actually changed his participants for each meal so that he might meet everyone of the assembly during these 6 weeks. That might be a very democratic institution, you might say, but it's also, of course, a part of that everyone should hear his views as well. So there's a two-sided business in that. In the next room, we're going to go rather quick through it, but this was also a very important room when it comes to the beginning of the Constitutional Assembly. This is where all the delegates delivered their protocols from all the elections around Norway. Now, every diocese or every county had three representatives. All the small towns around the coast in Norway had one representative, and some of the larger towns like Christiania, what we know now as Oslo, had 2 representatives, and up to Bergen in Western Norway, who had 4 representatives. So this was a rather normal, conventional kind of election system. The democratic part of it was that from every county election area there was to be one peasant representative. That was stated in the letters from the prince when the elections were issued. That was a very democratic part of it, contemporary speaking. What was not looked upon as very democratic was the way that some of the constituencies were from the military departments, like the armies, the lower, the different departments of the army and the navy throughout the country. The Swedes looked upon that as very undemocratic. They said that it was like a sultan's assembly of janissaries in Constantinople. So there were different opinions about the Norwegian election system. Here you also had one of the first confrontations. In this room there was this the committee of elections that sat, which was headed by the prince himself, Christian Fredrik, Bishop Bugge of Trondheim, and the prince's adjutant, Carl von Holten at least. So these 3 received all the protocols in this room on the first day, 10th of April. Now everyone, when they delivered, it was of course a society that was far more religious, far more deferential to authorities. So when they met the prince, they of course bowed and did all kind of reverence they did after receiving it. But you also see the first a sparkle of an opposition to what the prince and, you might say, the majority of the delegates stood for. And that was, of course, done by the only count in Norway, Count Wedel Jarlsberg, who had been known for his Swedish sympathies in the years before 1814. And he just approached the room, delivered more or less threw his protocol down to the prince, and showed the prince his back and went out. Now the other, and also an ally of this count, was Severin Løvenskiold, also a nobleman, but of a lower rank than the count. And he went further than that. He actually approached the table of them and told them off, all 3, and saying that he as a single free individual should not be declaring any kind of oaths to the fatherland or anything, which was part of what you had to do to become a part of this assembly. So there was, you might say, already some kind of a design of an opposition of this assembly. We're now going to look at the room for the only person who actually slept in this building during this Constitutional Assembly, and that was the prince himself, Christian Fredrik. So this was his chamber and his private chamber inside here. You see the royal bed and the royal slippers on the floor there. This was also part of the Constitutional Assembly, although Christian Fredrik never participated as a speaking representative in the assembly, apart from his welcoming speech and also his acceptance of the role as King of Norway on the 19th of May, 2 days after his election as a king. Right, well, we have now seen the ground floor and gone through that. Now we're going to go upstairs and approach the more political rooms. So please join me. Well, after the elections all around southern Norway were done, there was 112 participants who were chosen as delegates to the Constitutional Assembly. It was starting on the 10th of April and ended not until the 20th of May, which is the 6 months, maybe the most significant weeks in Norwegian history. Now, you have to start to host a Constitutional Assembly, you have to have a hall. And as I mentioned, Karsten Anker, he went bankrupt. Before that, in 1814, he was not a very well-off man, relatively speaking. Part of the elite, of course, but still, his economy didn't go very well. So this room in 1814, at least in the winter of 1814, was not ready for receiving a Constitutional Assembly. It was very raw, you might say. So what to do then to equip this for a Constitutional Assembly? Well, most people of his position had some white paint and also some red paint to, like this kind of a stenk or brush technique, making a illusionary marble effect. Norwegian pine there is plenty of course, and also some white linen, white guirlander to make the scenery look good. But in addition to that, also the paintings. The paintings here you see, are parts of his personal collection. And when all this is in place, voila, you have a constitutional hall. Now, this is not really like the Chamber of Mirrors of Versailles, of course, but it's a hall in a, you might say, Norwegian perspective at least. Among the paintings, there were many of his former colleagues in the Danish chambers, also relatives, but there's one painting that's not part of his original collection, and that was this of the forthcoming Frederick VII of Denmark. He was to become King of Denmark later. He was the son of Christian Frederick, son of the regent, and of course there is a message from the regent by getting this painting here, that is, I have a son, I can build a royal dynasty. So then, from the 10th of April, the first debate started the day after, the 11th of April, and you very early saw that there was two factions who more or less have diverting issues on many things. You had the clear majority that was later called the Independence Party, because of their view that Norway should be an independent state, no connections, union or anything with Sweden, also denying what the great powers had said earlier. The other, and this of course, this Independence Party, this faction, was led by Christian Magnus Falsen, also known as the father of the Constitution, because he was not only the leader of the faction, he was also head of the Constitutional Committee, which was the most significant committee, preparing not only the principles of the Constitution, but also the articles, the paragraphs themselves. And he also was one of the main authors of the draft that was presented before the Constitution Assembly was set. So he was very significant, and also leader of the large majority faction. The other faction, as I mentioned earlier, was headed by Count Wedel Jarlsberg. It is later called the Union Party because they looked on the trade relations, looking according to the great powers' view, wanting peace more than anything else, and also accepting some kind of union link with Sweden. They wanted some kind of independence, but not as radical as the Independence Party. The debates, as I said, they started with debating principles, 11 principles of the Constitution, then going over to the different articles themselves. So now we're going to look upon the room where the Constitutional Committee prepared for the debates and discussions here in this Constitution Hall. We now visit the Constitutional Committee's room. This is where the constitutional debates were prepared. We don't have that many treasures as such, or talismans of the constitutional history of Norway, but The closest we get is this. That is the very same table that the constitutional committees had their debates. In this committee, which consisted of 15 chosen men who were preparing the principles and also the paragraphs themselves. Now, before the Constitutional Assembly took place from the 10th of April, a lot of drafts had been sent into the Constitutional Assembly, and it was the main task of this committee to prepare and look through all these drafts. And there was about up to 30 different drafts, from complete law books like the one that Christian Magnus Falsen, the leader of the committee himself, had prepared for, up to the smaller drafts concerning only simple articles, like for instance some peasants who were very interested in how to deal with the production of liquor, for instance, or what to do with conscription, and the military was also very important for persons from the military departments. But you had also very differences in ideological views on this, from more absolutist-minded drafts coming from Copenhagen till lower parts of society from countryside of Norway, who, for instance, had very radical notions of not wanting any kind of monarchy, not wanting Danish citizens to have Norwegian positions or positions in Norwegian government, and full freedom of speech, full freedom of the press, and etc. So there was a wide variety of political ideas and drafts coming to this committee. So they had a really tough time dealing with all this as an editorial committee as well. But anyway, they were also put together from the two factions, although these factions did not. They were not modern political party as we know them, so that's more or less labels we'll put on them later. But both members of the, if you can call it members, representatives of the Independence Party and the Union Party was taking part in this committee. It was headed by Christian Magnus Falsen, the father of the Constitution, and he was known as a very effective man. Other representatives of the committee complained that he was going too fast forward and wanted to have to take more considerations of certain aspects. Still, the pressure on time was felt very hardly here in this committee, because the need to represent something from a Norwegian government perspective to the great powers, to the ongoing war theater in Europe. This was still part of the Napoleonic Wars. So, and very much like the Norwegian political system of today is built up on, the committees prepare for the main hall debates, you might say. And this went the same way, that the principles were prepared in this committee, then debated and voted for in Constitution Hall, and then the articles was also prepared for and made more accommodated to a public debate in the Constitution Hall later. So let's go back in the Constitution Hall again. As I said, the Norwegian Constitution was one of the most radical of its time, and that's at least on two features. And both of them concerns the legislative body, the law-giving body. From this moment, the law-giving body was named as Stortinget. And you might, there were these two features. It's on both the way people were voted in, or elected into it, that a large part of the Norwegian society was taking part in elections. This is a debated issue in Norwegian historiography, but in relatively numbers speaking, you might say that there was a large number of Norwegian citizens taking part in elections. And that was very much because of a peasant representative. Well, he was also a ship owner, but he was known as a peasant society person, and that was Theis Lundegård. And he fronted the words that there's only one voice, not the amount of earth that belong to each person who should speak in the legislative body. So it is one man, one vote, that is the principle, which also had a great influence on the radicality of the Norwegian Constitution. The other was the chambers. Like in the US, you have a Senate and you have a House of Representatives. In UK, you have, of course, a House of Commons and a House of Lords. But in Norway, we had a kind of two-chamber system called Odelsting or Lagting. But this was all elected from one body, Stortinget. So it was much more a quasi two-chamber or a one-chamber kind of legislative body, which also made it a very radical constitution of its time. So that's the two main features. Around 9th of May, you have all articles and all paragraphs of the constitution was voted for, put through. You had then on the 13th, on the 15th of May, you have a debate on economy, where many of the loveliest speeches were held, actually, although it was on an issue like economy. I don't need to say more about that. But still then, what was left was, of course, whether a monarch should be elected or not. And this was done on the 17th of May. And why do we celebrate the Constitution Day on the 17th of May? That is because it's dated. The Constitution is dated on 17th of May, but it was what you could say the political actions done on the 17th of May is the royal election, actually. And after some arguments, after the first votes were given, there was a full majority for supporting Christian Fredrik as King of Norway in 1814. And by that, he was given 2 days of consideration, and on the 19th of May, he was accepting the throne of Norway. And then all the assembly was over, and everyone went back to their homes. But of course, that's not the total history of Norway. Then there was first some weeks of celebration in Norway. Then the realities approached with the great powers emissaries coming to Norway, telling Christian Fredrik that this had no support from the great powers. Then there was a situation of war between Sweden and Norway. Norway lost. In August, there was signed a truce called the Truce of Moss from the small town of Moss. In the eastern part of Norway, which said, well, it was a truce saying that Sweden won, but the civil victory of Norway was that the Treaty of Kiel was replaced by the Constitution of Eidsvoll as the main document for the future of Norway. So that was, you can say, a civil victory within the military defeat. Then it was called for, of course, there was a condition on this truce, and that was that Christian Fredrik should abdicate as King of Norway. Then it was called for another assembly, then called Stortinget, as it was stated in the constitution. This Storting, called the Extraordinary Storting, or the Extraordinary Assembly of autumn 1814, they adapted the constitution to a union with Sweden and also with the King of Sweden as King of Norway. Very much, as I mentioned, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, Karl Johan, he was the main individual for this policy, and also head of the Swedish government, although he was not at the time Swedish king. That was Karl XIII, an old, he led all the business to Karl Johan to rule. And that ends more or less the story of Norway from 1814. Now, you might say that the Constitution of November, as this autumn assembly ended in, is more our Constitution of today. But still, it is what the principles and all the debates made here at Eidsvoll in April and May that define the political system of Norway and the political future of Norway. So. Okay, so I hope you have enjoyed this tour of Eidsvoll. This is what we want to contribute on in a digital format during these troublesome times of the COVID-19 virus situation. So we hope you have enjoyed the tour, and please welcome back here to Eidsvoll live in person when the conditions do that possible. Thank you.